At comedian Dorothy Parker's funeral service, the actor Zero Mostel explained that she had requested that there be no formal ceremony. In fact, he said, I suspect if she had her way, she wouldn't even be here at all. I imagine the mother in today's gospel would have rather been anywhere but where she was when Jesus first saw her. I bet she would have given anything to forego this funeral if it meant her son would still be alive. After all, this wasn't just her son. This was her only son, her only support in the world, her representative to the community, her provider after her husband's death. Now she dwells not only in the agony of loss, but also on the brink of poverty. And even though a great crowd is with her, like the widow at Zarephath, she's really all alone. Without a husband or now a male heir, she has no hope. She's as good as dead herself. But then when Jesus shows up, Luke says he had compassion for her. His heart went out to her. It's an interesting thing to say, don't you think? It's so easy to pass right by it because we have this ingrained image of a nice and caring Jesus. But honestly, for all of the different ways in which Jesus heals in the Gospels, it's rare for any evangelist to talk about the emotions that motivate Jesus' actions. They're generally more focused on the facts. So I think Luke is trying to tell us something important because this chance meeting had such an emotional impact on Jesus. Another thing to notice about today's gospel is that Luke doesn't say Jesus, but rather Lord. You might say, what's the big deal, Pastor? When the Lord saw her, he had compassion upon her and said, don't cry. This is the first time in Luke's gospel where Jesus is described as Lord. So I doubt it's an accident. Instead, what if Luke is trying to tell us that Jesus' acts of compassion describe and even define what it means to be Lord? In other words, to be Lord is to be open to the sufferings of another. To be Lord is to feel compassion, and not just feel compassion, but to act on it, to do something about it. To be Lord is to forego the funeral and reveal the grace of God. Because when you think about it, this story is all about grace. Pure, undiluted, unasked for grace. Unlike in last week's gospel, Jesus doesn't mention faith at all. He doesn't compare the mother's faith to the faith of the centurion. He doesn't talk about this woman's son's worthiness to be restored to life. Instead, he just notices her pain. He cares about her, and he does something about it. That simple pattern is a good way to forego the funerals in our own lives. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we won't die. But in noticing the pain in others' lives, in caring for them, and doing what we can for them, we become bearers of God's grace to others, just like Jesus did for the woman, the widow, in today's gospel. And we become aware of who is Lord of our lives as God's grace shows up in places and at times when we least expect, like it did for Paul, as he reminded us in today's second lesson. After all, this gospel isn't just about some guy who is brought back to life. It's about every moment that Jesus comes into our lives and touches us with an act of grace that we don't deserve. It's about every time we feel the presence of God in our lives when we least expect it. For those of us old enough to remember the Cold War, perhaps one of the most unexpected places to encounter this kind of grace is at a state funeral in Soviet Russia. And yet that is exactly where Vice President at the time, George Bush Sr., was when he encountered such grace at the funeral of former Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Bush was deeply moved by a silent protest carried out by Brezhnev's widow. She stood motionless by the coffin until seconds before it was closed. And then just as the soldiers began touching the lid, Brezhnev's wife performed an act of great courage and hope, a gesture that I think ranks as one of the most profound acts of civil disobedience ever committed. She reached down and she made the sign of the cross on her husband's chest. It may seem like a small thing, like a simple gesture, but many of us cross ourselves each and every day. Sometimes we do it as part of our prayers, sometimes we do it on Sunday mornings, but few of us ever think about the meaning behind that. And yet there, in a fortress of secular atheistic power, the widow of the man who had run it all hoped and prayed that her husband was wrong. She hoped that there was another life, that this life was not the end, and that the best life was represented by Jesus, who died on a cross. And that same Jesus would still have compassion and mercy even on her husband. You see, we are all dead. But the good news is that on the cross, Jesus reaches out his hand and touches each of us, just like he touched that funeral bier, so that death would have no power over us. Then he uses us to touch the lives of others with his contagious compassion. In just a few minutes, we will celebrate and bless our high school graduates. For your part, graduates, where are you? There's a couple there, another one over there. You've worked hard for your accomplishments, but you've not done this alone. You've been blessed with parents who have encouraged you when you needed it, comforted you when you failed, and done their best to teach you values that will help guide you through life. Quite simply, they have extended grace and compassion to you when you needed it most. And now, as you end one chapter of your life and begin another, I pray that you will learn from their examples and be quick to extend this Christ-like compassion to others, because it will transform your life and the lives of those around you. And if you have any doubt, simply ask those of us who have had a few years since our high school graduation if extending and receiving compassion has made a difference, has changed who you are. You see, that day in Nain, it wasn't just the young man who was raised. His mother was also restored to life because of Christ's compassion. But they weren't even the only ones. The crowd says a great prophet has risen among us. Jesus was raised that day in the eyes of the people, and so were the hearts of the people as that procession stopped and new life began. It began with a God who foregoes the funerals of our lives, who doesn't wait to be asked for compassion, and who on the cross raises us all to new life by the grace of God. Amen.